This is 24 into 7 channel of All India Radio. Today we dig into the vast treasure of our rich archives and bring to you a talk by an all-time eminent film actor, Balraj Sahni. Balraj Sahni left this mortal world in the year 1973, and this talk was recorded a few years earlier. Cinema has always mesmerized both the audience and its exponents, and Mr. Sahani expresses his views on creative realism in cinema. Soak yourself in this vintage recording.
My first reaction to the title Creative Realism was that it was vague. What exactly did it mean? I asked myself. Then I tried a way. I started considering its opposite. Was there such a thing as destructive realism in films? The answer to that was easier. Yes, there was. We see many commercialized foreign films in Bombay and in other cities. Do they not very often vulgarize and pervert realism? They have every appearance of being true to life, but in fact, they are not. They are very much an escape from it. I have met many American friends who have told me, please don't judge our country from the Hollywood films. Parents worry as much in America about the effect of such films on young people as they do in our own country. In contrast, the technique of our Hindi film is amateurish and often primitive. The Hollywood producer can make the unnatural look natural, whereas our Hindi producer has the gift of making even the natural look unnatural. There is a lot of sex exploitation in our Hindi films too, and the number of crime films is also quite large. But let me say, fortunately, our presentation is so implausible that the audience enjoys the film from the outside as if they were watching a tamasha. Songs, dances, and comedy sequences which are tagged on to the ineffective screenplay add to the tamasha spirit, so much so that a large number of our producers and directors have begun to consider these things as the most important ingredient of box office success. The audience seldom forgets that they are in a theater. The events of the film may interest, but never to the extent of getting the audience completely lost in the story. Perhaps that is why our films are so long. That is why an interval becomes necessary right in the middle of a picture. That is why the audience begins to applaud even individual dialogues. People are watching a show. They know that what they are seeing is not really happening, and it can't possibly happen. Thus, the total effect on their minds is rather superficial. I don't say that the emphasis on sex or crime in our films does no harm to the young people. It does, but not to the same extent it would do if it was splashed on the screen with all the allurances provided by a modern realistic technique. In that case, there would be a serious danger of the film doing permanent damage to the personality of the cinegoer. I have noticed that the sophisticated sections of our audiences are often taken in by the apparent realism of foreign films. They begin to believe in them and hold them up as an example to Indian producers. There is no harm in that. The Indian producers will do themselves a lot of good if instead of crudely copying the externals of foreign films, they would learn from them the trick of true to life presentation. But it is worthwhile for our educated people to note that as a rule, they too are victims of a hoax, to the same extent that our illiterate audiences are, who go to see Hindi films. The content of the technically superior foreign films is basically the same: an oversimplification, sentimentalization, and glamorization of life, an appeal not to the nobler instincts of man, but to his lower instincts. The aims of box office producers are the same everywhere: to serve out dope, to provide for the worried and tired human being the world of make believe excitement in which he can forget himself, forget his problems momentarily. Such aims of art could not be called creative. To the extent that they do harm, they can be called destructive. Realism is a very dear word to an artist. It has been so from time immemorial. Creative artists in every country have been trying to hold a mirror up to nature, as Shakespeare said. Like scientists, they too have been trying to, in their own field, to come to grips with life, so that their achievements can bring the consciousness of future generations to a higher level. In this process, creative laws have been discovered in the field of drama, novel, and other forms of literature, so that we can, with some justification, speak of the technique of realism. Let us take the example of a surgeon. He has mastered a wonderful craft with which he can heal the human body by performing most exact and complicated operations with the knife. He has spent years and years learning it, and for centuries, surgeons before him have been evolving their skill with untiring labor and sacrifice. And yet, it is not sufficient for a surgeon to be merely a master of technique. He must be an upholder of human values too. He must be a kind and sympathetic human being, because he knows very well that the slightest carelessness on his part can have dire consequences for the patient on his table. Many of us have read that fine novel by A.J. Cronin called The Citadel. In that book, the author describes how the desire for wealth and prestige can sometimes tempt eminent members of this noble profession to deviate from the path of duty. If that happens, a surgeon's skill ceases to be creative, it becomes destructive. In the same way, the technique of realism in films, which has made tremendous advances in the last 20 or 30 years, can become destructive if it is used merely for making money at the cost of the good of society. Having thus realized the meaning of destructive realism, one can venture to say that creative realism in films, in the same measure, should be its opposite. As I said above, I admit quite frankly that on the whole, we filmmakers in India have yet to master the technique of realism. There is a lot of unforgivable amateurishness in all fields of our work, in our screenplay writing, direction, acting, makeup, etc. We must get rid of it. Our artists, as well as technicians, must learn the art of doing things in a natural way, without exaggeration and without sacrificing accuracy. They must learn the art of creative synthesis, that is to say, of merging all departments of their work into a single harmonious unity. It is sometimes quite depressing to see that our film people, instead of suffering from any heavenly discontent, are quite complacent about the virtues of their own ignorance. They do not realize that art has no boundaries, that even the instruments of technique like camera, sound recording, etc., possess a soul provided the man behind them has a rich mind. Fortunately, however, our film industry is no longer the happy playground of illiterate people. People with good education and genuine creative urges are entering this field in fairly good numbers. It is their duty to broaden their mental horizons. They must not only know what our own ancient poets and dramatists like Kalidas, Bhavabhuti, etc., contributed towards realism, but also must acquaint themselves with the tremendous progress made in ancient Greece and in the European countries at the time of the Great Renaissance. They must equip themselves with the new dimensions brought into dramatic art by great men like Shakespeare, Moliere, Schiller, Ibsen, Shaw, and the others. Speaking from personal experience as an actor, I can say with confidence that the art of acting requires as much study and training as a doctor or a surgeon invests in his work. It is high time that our young artists discarded the notion that the only assets for an actor or actress are physical beauty and inborn talent. The actor can achieve versatility and depth in his work after years of study and practice. Men like Stanislavski have discovered and formulated the laws of modern acting, and it will not be wrong to say that they have made it almost as exact as a science. Unfortunately, this is still very insufficiently realized by us. Too much reliance is placed on inspiration of the moment and improvisation on the sets. Things are left to chance which should never be left to chance. The artists, instead of acquiring the method to control inspiration and to have it at their beck and call, content themselves with passive waiting for inspiration as if it belonged to another world and could only come by the sanction of some supernatural power. And they are not to blame either. In a large number of cases, they don't even see the script before they go on the sets. And then there are people who suffer from the mistaken notion that realism can come into our films simply by introducing high sounding and noble moral values in the industry. But that only shows ignorance of the realities of film work. Mastery of technique of realism is of the utmost importance before we can open a new chapter in our film history. But having said all this, I still wish to add that realism by itself is not enough unless it is inspired by creative human values. The content of art has a more fundamental place than its form. Art cannot be divorced from its environment. When we study the work of great poets, we also study the times in which they lived, the ideas of their age, the conditions of contemporary society. In the same way, if we have to study the film craft of a particular country, we must know something of that country, something of the problems of that country, the realities of its social life, the attitude of society towards filmmaking. Take our country, for example. Today it stands on the threshold of a new era. We have won our national freedom after many, many years of struggle in which countless sons and daughters of our land sacrificed everything. It is due to their heroism that today we can say that now our destiny is in our own hands. Centuries of alien rule deprived us of self respect, of opportunities, of self expression. It reduced the country to abject poverty and a state of helplessness. But today, a new task confronts us. To win freedom was difficult, but to reconstruct the country is even more difficult. Our government and our people have pledged themselves to fulfill this task, however dull or difficult this task might be. We cannot imagine anyone denying this. No one wants to revert to the status of a colonial country. No one wishes that India should remain permanently poor and backward. But we also know that this great task cannot be left to the efforts of our national leaders alone. It cannot be fulfilled merely by making speeches and holding conferences. All of us have to contribute towards it. In whatever field of work we are. That is the only way. Is it not obvious that for this great and noble task, our films can make a tremendous contribution? Our films can inspire the people to this effort, create in their minds the feelings, the urges to live not merely for themselves, but for the country also. Who does not know that the path of our progress is beset by innumerable obstacles? The vast majority of our countrymen are illiterate. They are unaware of what is going on in the world around them and live mentally in the 14th or perhaps the 15th century. Is it not possible for our films to inspire them with the knowledge that they can, with their own effort, improve their economic conditions, their social environment? Can they not teach them how to acquire a sensible approach towards epidemics, towards insanitary conditions, towards wasteful expenditure on marriages and other ceremonies? The masses of our people resign themselves in the hands of God or fate. Our films can tell them that in the context of new realities, they can be masters and not slaves of fate. Then there are the old and utterly worn out caste divisions, differences of faith and religions, of provinces and languages, which fritter away the energies of our people in useless quarrels. How easily our people are misled by demagogues. Instead of keeping before themselves the one and only ideal of national reconstruction, which is the only way of improving their lives and those of coming generations, our people get constantly distracted into dark bylanes of internecine conflict. With their own hands, they darken the future of their children. Is it not within the reach of our films to save them from such foolish and destructive actions? To remind them that if their unity could bring freedom, the same unity can also secure prosperity and happiness for all? If If our films dedicated themselves to these objectives, I would confidently say that they have embarked upon the path of creative realism. I am forestalling the question which invariably comes up. Do you want producers to make only propaganda films? Do you want people to be deprived of their entertainment? Fortunately, this question has become easier to answer now because a certain number of creative realists have already emerged among us and have done some significant work. First and foremost among them stands Satyajit Ray, and then there are so many others. Would you call Pathir Panchali or Apu Sansar a propaganda film? Would you call Anuradha a propaganda film? Or do you think these films are lacking in entertainment? A creative realist is not a propagandist. He belongs to the tradition of Zola, Tolstoy, Tagore. He is interested in exploring the truth in all its richness and glory and has the power to present it in that way. He has the lust for life, not for slogans. He has no axe to grind and no vested interest to protect. Thus, his art can never lack entertainment. On the contrary, he makes it supremely entertaining. I gave the example of Hollywood films in the beginning of my talk. It will be unfair on my part if I don't add now that at least some of these films are also imbued with the spirit of creative realism. Would you say that films like Bridge over the River Kwai or The Defiant Ones were merely propaganda films lacking in entertainment? Another question which also crops up whenever people discuss the problems of better films is, would it not be better to nationalize the film industry if our aim is to harness it in the cause of national reconstruction? I am not competent to answer this question. But this much I can say that a true artist never waits for ideal conditions. We cannot equip our film workers with the technique of realism or the spirit of creative realism merely by nationalizing the film industry. The desire to improve our work has to come from within. In the same way, the desire to serve noble human values and not the base ones has also to arise from within us. Each one of us has to voluntarily decide to make our work better and more creative in whichever department of filmmaking we find ourselves. In the end, I would wish to say one thing more. When we talk of backwardness and ignorance of our masses, we must also not forget that there is a lot of ignorance and backwardness among our educated people also. If the masses stray from the path of progress, the responsibility lies to a very great extent upon the educated sections. Today there is a vast gulf which separates the educated classes from the so-called uneducated classes. It has almost taken the shape of a rigid caste division. When we criticize the masses, let us not forget that we too are not above criticism. Is it not a fact that instead of being proud of our country, some of us are always underrating it? We admire Western films and Western art not as Indians, but as if we are ourselves Westerners. How little are we willing to sacrifice our own personal interests to those of the nation? Is it not a fact that the social circles in which we the educated people like to move and clothe ourselves are highly artificial and are far removed from our own languages, culture, and customs? Are these social circles not the hotbeds of intrigue, corruption, nepotism, snobbery, waste, and so many other evils which can only be called destructive to the national good? Do we not have a tendency to praise everything foreign and deprecate everything Indian? It annoys me tremendously when I hear a very condescending kind of criticism of our Indian films in these circles. And I begin to believe that one of the foremost aims of the creative realism in our films should be to prick the bubble of this highly artificial intellectualism in which everyone thinks he is superior to everyone else. I believe that our artists could do nothing better than to hold a mirror to the spurious refinement of these ladies and gentlemen. Creative realists in our films are and will be people who are proud of their great and mighty country, who love it with a passion the beauty of which cannot be described, who love their own languages, their own people, their own customs, and are convinced that the day is not far off when this motherland of ours will once again be a shining jewel on this earth, giving once again the message of universal peace, tolerance, brotherhood, and social justice. To that goal, along with their colleagues in other fields of art and science, the creative realists of the films will march with unfailing zeal and courage.
You just heard a talk, Creative Realism in Cinema, by the celluloid actor Balraj Sahni. That was recorded a few years before his demise. Retrieved from our archives, we welcome your suggestions and comments regarding our programs on our email ID, that is englishsw@gmail.com. This broadcast came to you on the 24/7 channel of All India Radio, Delhi. Please stand by for the next broadcast.